Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natalie Galusha, and I am the manager of the Center for Aging here at WashU. And this is our monthly Issues in Aging seminar series that we are offering today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we really kick off. As I mentioned a minute ago, we are in a Zoom meeting, so you have the ability to turn on your cameras and unmute your microphones. You're welcome to be on camera if you would like, but most certainly do not have to. And you can also unmute yourself, but please keep yourself muted until the end of our program when we will have a dedicated time for questions and answers. That being said, if you do have any questions as we're going along, the meeting chat is enabled. You can find that in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to put any questions in there at any time as we go along. You probably also got a notification today that this is being recorded, and it will be available on our website within the next week or so in case you have any issues or possibly even need to log off early. So again, thank you all for joining us today for our October Issues in Aging, which is featuring Derek Isaacowitz and focusing on emotion regulation in adulthood and older age. What have we learned so far and what's next? Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to give a real quick highlight of what we have coming up next month in case anybody is available to join that. Our Issues in Aging next month will be November 25th from noon to 1, also virtual here in Zoom. And our presentation will be Going Local, Funding Older Adult Programs and Services, presented by Nicole Brueggemann, who is the Executive Director of the Missouri Council on Aging. So there is a QR code on your screen there, as well as a link to the website where you can register for that. And I will be putting that in the chat again at the end of today's program. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. And Derek Isaacowitz is professor of psychological and brain sciences and director of the Lifespan Lab at Washington University here in St. Louis. He joined the WashU faculty after serving on the psychology faculty at Brandeis and Northeastern. He was an undergraduate student at Stanford University and received his PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. His research on emotion regulation and social perception in the context of adult development and aging has been funded by the National Institute on Aging, National Institute of Mental Health, and Felix Stiftung. This research has appeared in journals such as Psychological Science, Social and Psychological and Personality Science, Emotion and Affective Science. He was editor-in-chief of the Journals of Gerontology, Psychological Sciences, until the end of 2023, and in 2024 became a senior editor at Psychological Science. He previously served as chair of Social Psychology, Personality, and Interpersonal Process Study section at NIH, and he has been the recipient of the Springer Early Career Achievement Award from Division 20 of Adult Development and Aging of the American Psychological Association, the Margaret M. and Paul B. Baltus Foundation Award in Behavioral and Social Gerontology for outstanding early career contributions from the Gerontological Society of America, as well as Teaching and Mentoring Awards. So thank you so much, Derek, for joining us today, and we are most certainly looking forward to learning from you today.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for the invitation to speak today and for that introduction. Just want to make sure everybody can see my screen okay. I get a thumbs up. That's
You're
great.
Good, yeah.
What Natalie did not mention is that I have just moved to WashU as of August. And so being new to WashU and new to St. Louis, I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share the work that my lab has been doing before moving here that will hopefully set the stage for what we will be doing now that we are here at WashU. And I want to express my appreciation to the members of my lab back in Northeastern who are involved in doing the studies that I will talk to you about today, as well as my new lab here at WashU, who will be doing studies that I will be excited to hopefully tell you about in a year or two. And the work that I'll talk about today has been supported by NIA, NIMH, and Felix Stiftung in Switzerland. Let me just give you a roadmap for where I want to go in my talk today. I'm going to start presenting some findings on age differences in emotional experience, how people of different ages say that they feel in their everyday life. And then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about our attempts using various methods to investigate why age differences in emotional experience exist. I'm going to present some recent data contrasting things that we find in the lab versus when we test our participants at home. And then I'll try to wrap up by summarizing what I think we've learned so far about potential age differences in emotional regulation and give a preview of where I hope we will go next in this area of research. The starting point for this work is what is now a fairly well-replicated finding, at least in cross-sectional data, such that when asked about how much positive emotional experience they have in their life and how much negative emotional experience they have in their life, people, at least in their 60s and 70s, report fairly high levels of emotional well-being. This is one of the first findings from the MacArthur studies of midlife development that showed this cross-sectional age difference, where the older adults in the sample reported higher levels of positive affect and lower levels of negative affect than their younger counterparts. And this finding was surprising, given all that we know about physical and cognitive changes that happen with aging. The possibility that older adults report high levels of positive emotional experience, it's surprising. And as a reminder of just how surprising it was, this study, when it came out, actually appeared on the front page of the New York Times, which is not typical for psychology research at all, much less psychology research on adult development and aging. And so it seemed really surprising that older adults were reporting such high levels of emotional well-being. And other studies, at least cross-sectional studies, have found this pattern as well. And from my own research in the years since, like for many others who study emotional processes and aging, we've tried using a variety of methods to try to understand how can be the case that at least many older adults say that they're happy despite other changes in their physical and cognitive systems. And so the work that we have done over the years to try to unpack this age difference where older adults say that they're on average happy and maybe happier than their younger counterparts, various theoretical models have been offered in the adult development literature to try to provide testable hypotheses about how it could be the case that older adults achieve high levels of emotional well-being and emotional resilience. I was fortunate to be trained in the lab of Laura Carstensen at Stanford University when I was an undergraduate. And at that time, she was developing what came to be known as socio-emotional selectivity theory. And the basic premise of the theory was that time perspective changes throughout our lifespan. And when individuals, such as older adults, perceive their future time as limited, it leads to emotional changes, and in particular, changes in how different emotional goals are prioritized, so that when an individual, like an older adult might, perceives their future time as being limited, it causes them to downplay goals that might be associated with feeling bad right now, but might help them achieve things in the future. And they'll relatively prioritize goals about how they feel in the here and now. So the theory argues that under conditions of limited time, older adults will prioritize emotional goals about how they feel. They will care more about how they feel than about other possible goals, learning new things, making new acquaintances, and that could help them to achieve these high levels of positive emotional experience. In the years after I left the lab, the next cohort of students in the lab tried to work on mechanisms that might link time perspective and goal prioritization on the one hand to feeling good on the other hand. And what that work suggested, became termed an age-related positivity effect, such that older adults seem to show a preference in their information processing for positively valenced over negatively valenced material. The idea here is if somebody said, okay, go walk around campus, but try to make yourself feel as good as possible, you might choose to focus on positive things in the environment. Try not to think about negative thoughts or things that are worrying you. So it's sort of a common sense approach to how somebody with the goal of feeling good might try to process information in their environment in a way that would help them to feel good. When the initial findings about age-related positivity effects came out, there was a lot of excitement in the aging literature and psychology about them. This idea that there's this age difference in how older versus younger people attend to and remember emotional information, and that could underlie age differences in emotional experience. And so different labs use different techniques to study these so-called age-related positivity effects. Other labs studied it in memory. Do people remember more? Older people remember more positive than negative images that they've seen, for example. In my lab, starting in 2001, we were interested in the attentional implications of positivity effects. So we used eye tracking to look at fixation patterns of older and younger individuals as they viewed different images and videos that varied in their emotional content. And so we were inspired by socio-emotional selectivity theory and interested in testing the presence of age-related positivity effects in fixation patterns using eye tracking. And so in a number of studies, again, some using images, some using videos, all of this was emotional content. Tracking eye movements and recording fixation patterns, we did find that older adults tended to fixate relatively more on positive emotional images and videos, and relatively less than their younger counterparts on negative images and videos. And we found this both for still images as well as for videos. And so this was interesting to us. We were excited to find what we thought was support for age-related positivity effects in attention as older people viewed emotional images and videos. But it sort of raised this bigger question that we then had to tackle was, well, how does this relate to how older people say that they feel? And put another way, is this emotion regulation? And are older adults regulating their emotions differently, as indicated by their different fixation patterns? At the same time as the work that I just very briefly summarized was happening in the aging literature, looking at age-related positivity effects in attention and memory, in a parallel literature, separate from the aging literature, James Gross and colleagues were developing what they call the process model of emotion regulation. And it provided a framework for researchers to investigate the different ways that people might try to change how they felt. And the process model offered 5 different types of strategies that somebody might use if they were feeling something unwanted and they wanted to change how they felt. And so the process model specified these different strategy groupings and initiated lots of research separate from the aging literature on these different strategies. Some of the strategies focus on changing the situation that you're in. Some of them, like cognitive change, are about how you think about what's going on and changing your thought process or reappraising your thought process about what is making you feel bad, if in the case where you're trying to make yourself feel better from something bad. And response modification has to do with changing your outward expression of how you're feeling to try to change how you feel. You can see right in the middle there, though, James Gross's process model specifies this emotion regulation strategy called attentional deployment, changing your attention to help yourself to feel better. And we were struck, of course, that we were studying fixation patterns to emotional images and videos in the context of aging because of the idea of age-related positivity effects. But we realized right away that we could also think about what we were measuring with eye tracking as a behavioral measure of the emotion regulation strategy of attentional deployment. And this was sort of an aha moment where that inspired us to try to start putting together the aging theories about motivation and positivity effects with the emotion regulation theories and frameworks about different strategies that people could use to regulate their emotions. And as we started thinking about that, it really opened up a lot of new avenues of possible studies. So for example, we've been focused just on attention deployment, but maybe there are interesting age differences in the emotional situations people choose to select into or out of, or modification of situations. And so it really inspired us once we made this connection to the process model to think about how there could be age differences in any of these strategies. But we also had in mind the idea of positivity effects, and we started trying to think about how to put those 2 different approaches together. The field of emotion regulation really exploded after James Gross proposed the process model. And so there was a lot of research, primarily in younger adults, comparing different strategies. For example, testing whether using reappraisal or cognitive change as a strategy was more effective than using suppression or response modulation as a strategy. And long story short, it seems like reappraisal is more effective than suppression. In the context of aging, many studies, some of our own included, started to look for age differences in the use or effectiveness of strategies. Do older people use attention deployment more or reappraisal more or suppression less than younger adults? And this was especially important, I think, because of the emotional experience findings I mentioned at the start of my talk. If older people report high levels of happiness, high levels of emotional well-being, it seems logical that we might imagine that they are different or better at regulating their emotions as a way of accomplishing those high levels of emotional well-being. And so lots of studies start to look for where these differences are between the age groups in their use of emotion regulation strategies. But after a number of years of doing work comparing younger and older adults in their use of or the effectiveness of different emotion regulation strategies, basically people came up empty. There was not much evidence from our research in other labs for any age differences at the strategy level. So in terms of how frequently older versus younger adults use reappraisal or how effective reappraisal was for younger versus older adults, most of the findings were either didn't show much of any, they certainly showed no evidence for age differences, and in some well-powered studies actually using Bayesian approaches to test for equivalence across groups supported age equivalence in strategy use or effectiveness. So that was surprising. If older adults say that they're happier on average, how could there not be any age differences in the emotion regulation behavior that could support those differences in experience? And so this is where we have been able to bring in more of the idea of positivity effects from the aging literature. Another aspect of emotion regulation that is related to strategies but distinct and has not been frequently studied until recently are what are known as emotion regulation tactics. Emotion regulation tactics are how a particular strategy is implemented in a specific situation. So I am in a situation where I would like to make myself feel better. I could use the high level strategy of attention deployment. But how do I deploy my attention in the situation to make myself feel better? Do I try to look at something on my phone that makes me laugh? Do I try to distract myself mentally to sort of neutralize something that might make me feel bad? And so as we thought about it, it seemed like tactics, the ways that strategies are implemented in situations, might be a way that we could combine the idea of the process model with positivity effects, because when we thought about tactics as ways that strategies are implemented, we realized that there are features of tactics that may be shared across strategy types that also may correspond to aspects of positivity effects. So when we are in a situation where we want to regulate our emotions, we think about what is available to us to help us. And there might be some positive things that we want to approach. There might be some negative things that we want to move away from. And in our attempt to regulate and change how we feel, we might move toward or away from elements in our environment, external environment or internal one, that are relatively more positive or negative. We can look at the funny video on our phone. We can try to distract ourselves mentally by not paying attention to the thing that might upset us. We have, over the past 5 years or so, done a number of studies of these so-called tactics. You will see, as I show you the results, that the terminology has shifted a little bit because we originally referred to tactics as being positivity up or down regulating and negativity up or down regulating. But we realized in recent efforts to provide a more conceptual understanding of tactics that terminology was confusing because it's also how we would talk about people's emotional goals. Am I trying to feel more positive or less negative? That's the goal of my emotion regulation. It turns out that the tactics that people use are not the same as their emotional goals. Somebody could want to feel less negative. That would be their goal, but they could use a tactic in their behavior to achieve that goal that involves approaching something positive. So to try to minimize confusion between the goals and the tactic behaviors, we've tried to change the wording a little bit. So that is why you may see some different wording across some of the results. We thought that by shifting the focus of emotion regulation studies of aging away from general strategies and towards these more specific tactic dimensions, we could potentially find more evidence for age differences that would inform us about why older and younger people may show different levels of emotional well-being. And just to show you how you can get these tactic dimensions across the strategies specified in the process model, what you see here is each of the 5 strategies in the process model, and for each of them, how a tactic can be implemented that involves approaching something positive, moving away from something negative, or approaching something negative. We also have this column for acceptance because that has been of interest, though it doesn't fit the tactic dimensions perfectly. But just an example from attention deployment. To use attention deployment to regulate how you feel, you could attend to something positive in the environment. You could also attend to something negative in the environment if you're interested in it. That would be negative approaching. But you could distract yourself away from something negative, either internally distracting yourself mentally or distracting yourself, your actual overt attention in terms of what you look at. And those would be different tactics under the same strategy of attentional deployment. And here you can see that for each strategy, we have the various tactics, and they are a way to connect age-related positivity effects to the process model of emotion regulation. So I'm going to turn now to a few recent studies where we have looked at age differences in tactic use and effectiveness across several different contexts. The first study where we investigated this more directly was an experience sampling study where participants were surveyed on their phone 5 times a day for 10 days. The sample was 149 younger, middle-aged, and older adults. And each time they were surveyed, they were asked about whether they had tried to change their emotional experience since the last survey. And if they did, they were asked about the strategies they used as well as the tactics. And what I'm going to show you next is a little bit of a busy figure, but I'll walk you through it. This is frequency data in terms of which tactics were most frequently used and whether they varied by age. And a few things I want to point out in this. The first is the most frequently used emotion regulation behaviors across age groups did not cluster by strategy. Instead, they clustered by tactic dimension. So the most frequently used emotion regulation behaviors, I should say, across the age groups was making situations more positive, seeking positive situations, attending to positive reappraisal. So all of these positive approaching tactics, these were the most frequently used regardless of age. Now, interestingly, older adults use them even more than the other age groups. But it was not like there was some fundamental reorganization of emotion regulation behavior across age groups. The positive approaching tactics were the most frequently used by every age group. The older people just use them slightly more. What I think is also important to note here is if we were only investigating emotion regulation strategies, like almost every other study of emotion regulation in everyday life, we would totally miss the story where the most frequent behaviors were positive approaching ones. Instead, it would look like maybe the situational strategies were the most frequently used, but we wouldn't know that it was specifically about moving towards positive things. And so I think this shows the value of studying tactics rather than just strategies, and also illustrates that there might be age differences, but they're not huge age differences. They are older adults using the most frequent behaviors even more than the other age groups. Negative approaching is very infrequent, but it was the younger adults who did do it the most. In another experience sampling study, this was a study of 236 young, middle-aged, and older adults. You'll hear more about the study later for some other measures in it. It was a study where participants were followed over a whole year period, and during that year, they participated in 5 measurement bursts of experience sampling, 8 weeks apart. During each burst, they filled out surveys on their phone 6 times a day for 5 days in a row, and then they repeated it 4 more times over the course of the year. And in this study, we were specifically interested in tactics of attentional deployment. And so we asked more detailed tactic questions about attentional deployment to try to get more specifically at the different ways that people could implement attention deployment in their everyday life. So rather than just asking about positive, negative, we asked about, first of all, did you try to focus your attention? If you used attention deployment to try to change how you feel, did you try to focus your attention on something, or did you try to shift your attention away from something to something else? Then within each of those, we asked, okay, were you focused or shifting to your external environment or to your internal thoughts and feelings? And then finally, and we don't have this drop down here for focus, we have, did you shift towards something positive, towards something negative, or away from something negative to try to make sure that we also got at the tactic dimensions that I mentioned before. So here we're looking specifically at age differences in the tactics of attention deployment in everyday life. And we did find some age differences in the frequency with which the different age groups used different kinds of tactics within attention deployment specifically. Older adults use less negative internal attention focus and less negative attention shift, whereas younger adults use less positive internal attention focus. We also in the study asked people what kind of situation they were in when they tried to regulate their emotions to start as a first step to see whether there were differences in the emotion regulation tactics that people use as a function of the particular context they're in. Are they by themselves? Are they with somebody else? If they're with somebody else, is it they with their spouse? Are they with family members? Are they with acquaintances? Are they at work or at home? Or are they somewhere else entirely? And we did find here that context did relate to tactic use, and that varied to some degree by age. Younger adults were less likely to use a positive focus when they were working or when they were by themselves. Younger adults were more likely to use a shift toward positive and a shift away from negative when they were at home. And both age groups, interestingly, were less likely to use a shift toward negative when they were working. This study, I mentioned it went over the course of a year and had different components to it in addition to the experience sampling of attention deployment tactics. We were still collecting data for the study when COVID-19 started in early 2020, and the study was completed over the rest of the year of 2020. So we have people's responses about their tactic use before COVID and then during COVID. So we compared whether the particular context of COVID-19 was related to any differences in tactic use and whether that varied by age. And we did find differences. They're sort of interesting. I'm not sure what to make of them, but I think they're interesting to present nonetheless. Basically, what both age groups showed was a reduction in the likelihood of using the tactics that they had used the most frequently pre-COVID. Older adults were using more of these positive, towards positive and away from negative tactics, and they reduced their use of them, whereas younger adults had been more working with negative, shifting toward negative and negative focus, and they use less of them as well. And so we saw this sort of across the board reduction in the frequency of tactic use may be associated with being home more, doing fewer things that required or demanded emotion regulation. But I think it just interestingly illustrates that in that particular context, it led to changes, to some degree, age-graded changes in tactic frequency. In another study of tactics, this was an online study done by my former doctoral student, Hannah Wolf, in which she asked people in early 2021 to reflect back on historical events that this was all participants in the United States. They were asked about events that had happened during 2020, and they were asked retrospectively to answer questions about the tactics they used in managing their feelings about those events. And so for each event, the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, killing of George Floyd, and the 2020 presidential election, participants did a 2-minute reflection, trying to get themselves back into the mental space they were in around that historical event and the feelings they had. And then they were asked questions about the strategies they used, as well as the tactics they used in managing their response to those events. And so we can look at the composition of what people said that they did and whether it varied by age in terms of the tactic dimensions. Positive approaching, negative receding, negative approaching, and then also we have acceptance here. And again, we see the terminology a little bit different because it's changed recently. We did find age differences in response to historical events, and to some degree, it varied as a function of the historical event. So we found, and these are going to be color-coded to help you a little bit on these complicated graphs, older adults use less negative receding tactics for the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak specifically. They use less negative approaching tactics for the killing of George Floyd. This was an event where younger adults reported relatively high levels of negative approaching, and the usual interpretation of that is they were sort of activating themselves with anger to motivate themselves to engage in political action. Across both the COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, older adults reported more use of acceptance for the two events, whereas for the 2020 presidential election, we did not find significant age differences in the tactics that people reported using. Again, this was retrospectively since the study was done online in early 2021. Finally, our most recent everyday life data on tactics comes from a newer experience sampling study of 236 younger, middle-aged, and older adults. They participated in a 3-month-long study where once a month they did 7 days of experience sampling where they answered questions again about their emotion regulation behavior and the context that they were in on an app on their phone. Again, 5 times a day, 7 days in a row, 3 times, 4 weeks apart. And we asked them about their use of different emotion regulation tactics and categorized them into these categories: positive approaching, negative receding, and acceptance. To try to provide a different way of looking at the frequency of people's tactic use in a way that helps us to appreciate that frequency data in emotion regulation is hard to interpret, we borrowed from the social gerontology literature where Kahn and Antonucci developed this way of studying social relationships called social convoys. And it was a way of representing how people's closest social network may change over time, and that people have a hierarchical categorization of their social partners, where some people are really close. In the social convoy literature, that's your first circle of social partners. Then you have the next category of people who are close but not as close, your second circle. And then you have acquaintances in your third circle. And lots of interesting research in social gerontology has looked at who's in, who's out, who moves between circles using this convoy model. And we thought that this could be a really cool way to represent how at a point in time, some people are drawing on some particular set of tactics or strategies, whereas other people might be using a different set of strategies and tactics. And in particular, it takes into account the fact that if I use reappraisal a third of the time, that means something different if that is far and away the most frequent emotion regulation behavior I use compared to any of the other ones, versus if I use reappraisal a third of the time, but I actually use distraction even more. So the ways that these frequencies interact, they are meaningfully hierarchically organized. So we thought that we could create these emotion regulation convoys that describe how individuals use their different emotion regulation behaviors. And this figure just shows 2 actual examples of older people, but older people showing different convoy representation. So our first older adult, if you look at their inner circle, the emotion regulation behaviors they use the most frequently, so this corresponds to your closest social partners in the social convoy model. Basically, for this person, they rely almost exclusively on upregulating positivity. So the most frequent emotion regulation behaviors they engage in are all positivity upregulating. The second older adult has a different range of tactics in their first circle of most frequently used behaviors. They alternate between negativity downregulating and acceptance. So these are just examples. When we look at the data, so we did find, I should say, that there were context effects on tactic use. And sorry, I have these next 2 slides out of order. Regardless of age, people did vary their use of tactics depending on the context they were in. And we did ask them about their context, what they were doing when they were trying to regulate their emotions and who they were with. Regardless of age, people were more likely to use positive approaching tactics in situations involving their family and friends, health, money, or leisure, and more likely to use negative receding tactics in situations involving health. But the really interesting thing is the age differences in the makeup of the inner circle, the makeup of those most frequently used tactic behaviors. We found here the only tactic dimension that showed an age difference in terms of whether its likelihood of being in that first circle, the most frequently used tactics, was negativity receding or negativity downregulating. Older adults use fewer of these distancing, receding from negative tactics in their everyday life in this experience sampling study. In the study, we also measured the effectiveness of different emotion regulation behaviors. And the way that we did that, it's hard to do in experience sampling because the event has already happened. So typically, people may ask about how people are feeling after regulating. We compared how people said they felt before they tried to change how they felt and how they said they felt after they changed as a measure of the effectiveness, though it's not a perfect measure. And we found that across age groups, when people used positive approaching tactics, they felt better after they tried to regulate. In contrast, when people use negative receding tactics, so trying to distract yourself from something negative, to try to reappraise something to be less negative, people actually, that was associated with worse post-regulation affect, and that was especially the case for younger adults. So younger adults, when they tried to distance themselves from negative things, detach from negative things, that was actually associated with feeling worse after trying to regulate. Whereas across age groups, people felt better when they tried to focus on something positive, make a more positive interpretation, choose a more positive situation. So just to summarize these several studies, it seems like even though there are few, if any, age differences in frequency of strategy use in emotional regulation, we do find age differences in tactic use. And even though the particular pattern varies a little bit from study to study, it seems like there is a shift where older adults are relatively more utilizing the positive approaching tactics and relatively less utilizing the negative receding tactics. And this is interesting because in the data I just showed you about effectiveness, the positive approaching tactics seem to be most effective at helping people feel better and certainly more effective than the negative receding tactics. So if older adults are using more positive approaching tactics relative to negative receding ones, and the positive approaching tactics are relatively more effective at helping people feel better compared to the negative receding ones, that is the closest pattern we've seen where there's a parallel between the emotion regulation behavior and age differences in that behavior and age differences in emotional experience. So it helps us to maybe get closer to an emotional regulation explanation for how and why older people say that they feel such high levels of emotional well-being. We do find that context plays a role. You see situation effects and historical event differences. So it's not just a person, somebody has their tactics that they use in everything. People modulate it to some degree as a function of tactics. And again, we're working on better terminology to distinguish tactics from goals. I want to shift gears a little bit here to another kind of research that we do that I think does tie into the idea that emotion regulation varies by context in aging, but it uses a different measurement approach. So far, everything that I've shown you has been self-report data. It's repeated, intensive self-report data, asking people to respond to surveys multiple times a day, but it's still all self-report data. And I want to loop back to our work in the lab where we had used eye tracking to look at age differences and how people attend to emotional images, going back to that idea of age-related positivity effects. At the same time as we were using experience sampling to ask people repeated intensive self-report questions in their everyday life on their phone, we also tried to think of ways, and we continue to do this, to take methods that we have in the lab for studying emotional processes, and implement them in other settings to see if what we observe in the lab is actually representative of how people behave in their everyday life. And because we had consistently found age differences in fixation patterns using eye tracking in the lab, we were interested to see if we could replicate those patterns by using eye tracking in people's homes. Now, I'll just briefly mention that the work that we're going to talk about is what is known as stationary eye tracking, in which a participant is sitting in front of a computer monitor and the tracking device is actually attached to the monitor. And we have actually also done mobile eye tracking where participants wear the eye tracking device on their head and then they move around. And you probably are thinking, oh, if we're doing eye tracking at home, then we are using mobile eye tracking so people can move around. We can see the environment they're in and what they're looking at. And someday we will do something like that. But we have learned from mobile eye tracking work in the past is that it's very hard to interpret that data because everybody's environment is different and it requires a huge amount of manual coding of fixation. So in this study, it still was ambitious, but it was a different kind of ambitious. We tried to do stationary eye tracking, which permits slightly easier analysis of fixation data, but we ported it into people's homes and compared it to how they performed in the lab. This allowed us to take what we'd observed in the lab to see if people behave the same way at home, but it also allowed us to test for fixation patterns over a much wider range of stimulus videos and a more extended period than we ever had done before. So in this study, it was a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Zurich. We tested participants both in Boston and in Zurich, Switzerland, though the middle-aged participants were all run in Boston, the older participants were run in both locations, the younger participants were run in Zurich. And I should say that this is a bigger sample than we had ever collected eye tracking data for in any of our in-lab studies, maybe except for one. But we were combining our in-lab assessment with at-home eye tracking assessment. So participants started the study. They came to the lab. We did eye tracking with them in the lab where we presented them with different emotional videos and asked them to look naturally at them as we did in all of our studies. Then, at 2 periods during the year-long participation in the longitudinal study, we brought the eye tracker to their house and we set it up in a place that they agreed to. And we showed them how to calibrate themselves and how to run themselves through the study. And then participants did 2 eye tracking sessions a day for 5 days, where they saw another set of emotional videos with no experimenter present. Then we came and got the eye tracker. We brought it back to them some number of months later to do another 5-day session where they did another 10 of these sessions, 2 each day over the 5 days. And in each session, they watched positive, negative, and neutral videos, and we record their fixations to see how they looked at the videos. And we could compare their fixation patterns to emotional videos in the lab versus how they were at home using exactly the same eye tracker, exactly the same laptop. Everything else was totally comparable across the settings, but the setting was different. It is not trivial to do eye tracking in people's homes using this device. Calibration was challenging, though we tried to make it as user-friendly as possible to calibrate and then to collect data on yourself without an experimenter present. I already mentioned the study was ongoing when COVID happened, so we suspended data collection for several months in early 2020, but then we actually got permission in the summer of 2020 to start data collection again. So basically a very intrepid research assistant would drive to participants' houses, would drop a backpack off at their door that had the laptop and the eye tracker. Then the research assistant would go back to their car and Zoom with the participant and show them how to set it up and how to calibrate and test themselves and do any troubleshooting over Zoom. And then we left it there at their home for 5 days, and then they would leave the backpack at their door 5 days later for us to pick up. So we were able to do no contact version. And even though the data quality was not as good at home as in the lab, we still were able to get quite a bit of usable eye tracking data. And so the main question here is, were there differences in fixation patterns to emotional images between age groups in the lab and at home? And I'm going to show you graphs that are a little bit hard to parse in this short period of time. So I'm going to focus on what I think are the most important patterns here. But we did see an interaction between age group, the valence of the videos, and their location, meaning that people's fixation patterns to the emotional videos differed between the lab and at home, differentially by valence type, differently by age group. First of all, we thankfully found in the lab that the more typical age pattern where older adults, but also younger adults, fixated relatively more on the positive parts of positive videos compared to the other age groups and compared to their fixation on other valence types and at home. But what's surprising to us and quite interesting is that the pattern of fixation for older adults really was different at home than in the lab. And in particular, what we found was that the older people elevated their fixation on the negative parts of negative videos at home compared to themselves in the lab. So in the lab, we saw the typical age-related positivity effect pattern where older people fixated relatively less on negative. But at home, the older people really ramped up their fixation on negative. And so that was surprising and interesting. So we saw, if anything, an age-related negativity effect at home, whereas we saw the age-related positivity effect in the lab. And so, it's hard to interpret this too much because it's just one study, even though it was a big sample for this sort of work. But it suggests that there are context effects. And even for something that seems like a behavior like fixation, eye fixation to emotional videos, people of different ages modulate their attention, modulate their fixation differently, depending whether they are at the lab and at home. And it's interesting to think about how we think about the sources of age differences in these behaviors and why should they be modulated as a function of whether somebody is at home versus in the lab. So I know we're reaching the end of our time, so I want to briefly summarize and talk about some future directions. So to summarize the work I've shown you so far, there do seem to be interesting age differences in emotion regulation behavior, but they're about tactics, not about strategies, and they're not big. They are pretty small differences, but they are about tactics. Older adults seem to shift from using negative receding tactics to using positive approaching ones more. And that seems to be a potentially adaptive shift because positive approaching tactics seem to be more effective at regulating mood. But I want to reiterate that age differences seem to be very of degree rather than of type. In the aging literature, you sometimes will see people talk about emotion regulation is something that fundamentally reorganizes as people get older. And I don't think that's the case. I think instead you see these small differences in the frequency of the more effective tactics. We do see evidence across multiple ways of testing that context is important. So we saw effects of COVID-19, we saw effects of specific contexts, and then we saw this at-home versus the lab difference, which I think is super interesting. When we were trying to publish that paper, reviewers asked, given that you saw a difference in behavior between the lab and at home, what happened at home that was so different? And it's interesting to think about and speculate about, and I certainly have some ideas about that. But it seems to me like, shouldn't we also be asking, well, what happens in the lab? Why is the lab so different? Maybe that's the different context. And we've thought a lot about what happens when older participants come to participate in studies in our lab that might inadvertently lead them to behave a certain way. So for example, we historically have worked very hard and will continue to do so to make sure that every participant who comes to the lab has a great experience. We have an undergraduate meet them at their car and park with them and come to the lab with them, and we give them coffee and make sure that they're feeling good. And so we may inadvertently be creating the set, a positive responding set, such that we prime positivity effects by making sure that our participants are having a good experience when they come to the lab. It raises the possibility that nobody in the lab has volunteered to do yet, that maybe we should be trying to be cranky and unpleasant to our participants when they come to the lab and see if that changes their behavior. We have not quite gotten up the courage to do that version of the study, but it does suggest that we need to think about the dimensions on which these different contexts vary and how we're going to differentially manipulate those dimensions to see how contexts play a role in emotion regulation, because it seems like some contexts may be very strong in terms of how they constrain emotion regulation behavior. Some situations may have strong affordances in terms of how they dictate emotion regulation behavior. If you're at work and somebody upsets you, you can't leave the situation typically. So you are constrained in what emotion regulation behavior is available to you in that context. And so we're starting to think now about how we can test different contexts for how they might constrain or promote age differences in emotion regulation behavior. So as we continue our work here at WashU, we're trying to figure out new ways of testing these processes, both in the lab, but especially in people's everyday life at home and as they go about their day at work, in other settings. We're trying to look at how people flexibly or not match their emotion regulation behavior to the different settings they're in specifically. We're interested in how different levels of cognitive abilities in older adults may constrain or promote different emotion regulation behavior. And we also are interested in to what extent understanding the adaptive behaviors that many older adults are engaging in, how that may inform our understanding of older adults who are with cognitive impairment or otherwise may be struggling also in their emotional lives, what implications this may have for promoting tactic use that will help them feel better in the context of their cognitive impairment. If positive approaching tactics are the most effective, it suggests interventions that might be promote positive approaching tactic use. For example, savoring interventions seem promising for promoting positive approaching tactics. Just in terms of last implications, emotional life of older adults seems more positive than many people would think, given other changes that happen with aging. Recent longitudinal evidence that has come out suggests more variability, though it's still not negative. It's not just that every aging individual is over time within person experiencing increased positivity. Emotion regulation happens, though, in an aging body, but also with a lifetime of experience, as well as a lifetime of selecting situations to be in and the implications of those choices. And so we're now thinking about ways of integrating more measurement of body changes to see how they relate to behavioral changes. But overall, I hope that we can reframe the question away from, are older people better or different emotion regulation, to what would happen in the body, the brain, and the context that would get somebody to change the emotion regulation behavior they've used throughout adulthood once they get to a certain age, and why would that change happen? And I think that reframing the question that way will be really useful in isolating particular mechanisms by which we can test for age differences and integrate them across systems between behavioral, biological, and neural systems. And with that, I'll close. Being new to the WashU and St. Louis community, I'm very excited to make new connections around campus and around the medical school to work on emotion across age-related contexts. So here is contact information, as well as a place where you can find more on these publications. So thank you for your attention today. I look forward to questions that you might have in our remaining time.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was a great presentation. Obviously, lots to fit in the time we have, but covered it very well. So if anybody has any questions, do feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand under the React button there on the main menu, I will call on you to ask your question out loud. But the first question that we have here was back to some of your earlier slides where you're categorizing ages into younger, middle-aged, and older adults. And the question was, what was the age range for those?
So that's a great question, and it's varied a little bit from study to study. Typically, in these studies, well, in the most recent experience sampling studies, older adults were 60 or 65 plus, but they did range in most studies up through the 80s. Now, we don't have the sample sizes to compare that to do I think what would be the obvious comparison, an important one to compare the young old to the older old within the older adult age group. In many of the studies where we have the middle age group, we do have a continuous adult sample ranging from 20 to 80 or 85, where we have people in each decade. However, we often do not have equal bin numbers of people in each decade, which is why we end up then presenting the analyses categorized into age groups. So usually it would be 18 to 39, then 40 to 59, 60 plus. Varies a little bit depending on the study. But ideally, in future work with larger samples, we would just present the continuous age data by decade. But I don't want you to think that we only have people in their 60s and 70s in the studies. We do have people in their 80s and occasionally in their 90s as well. But we just don't have the sample size in most cases to analyze within the older adult age group.
Okay, great, thanks. That was the next question as well, was that if there's research on people 80 plus, that it seems that most is done in the 60s and 70s, but you did pretty much answer that unless you want to add anything
But there
else.
is, I mean, it's a really important question. In terms of cross-sectional data, there is some studies that I've been involved with and others as well, that into the 80s, you still will see the cross-sectional age benefit on emotional experience. But once you get into the late 80s and 90s, then you don't see it. It sort of flattens out. There are studies of terminal decline in emotional experience where you look back 1 to 2 years before people die, they have a big drop off in emotional well-being, not surprisingly. Recent longitudinal data, it's not longitudinal in the sense that they have followed the same people from 20 to 80, but it's longitudinal in the sense that they are able to estimate changes in 10-year bins as they follow people. And then again, once you get into the few samples they have where people are in their 80s, you do not see typically positive age changes. You also don't always see a drop off, but the sort of positive trajectory for emotional well-being and cross-sectional and some longitudinal data, I think it is strongest into the mid 70s, but not a huge amount of data on people in their 80s yet.
Great, thanks, Derek. Callie, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And welcome to WashU. Could you talk a little bit more about what the research shows in terms of how these emotion regulation strategies are tied to health? I'm curious if certain strategies are related to like blood pressure, for example. And then if so, are there ways that we can train people to undertake these more health promoting emotion regulation strategies? So like an intervention. So thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Welcome to you as well. So I have a lot to say. I'm trying to think about how to give an answer to that. I have a lot to say on that. There is some research linking physical functioning broadly construed and broadly assessed to self-reported emotion regulation behavior. However, the only self-report measure that is widely used only compares reappraisal and suppression. And so there may be studies that find, for example, that higher heart rate variability is associated with higher self-reported use of reappraisal. Something that we are just starting in the lab right now is trying to look behaviorally at tactics and strategies, but also with the psychophysiology setup that we have in the lab. So the data, I think, is too preliminary. It seems likely that there will be those relationships, but the things that have been published so far, I think, are pretty limited in what they can conclude. But we certainly think about interventions. I mean, in the emotion regulation literature, I think the way that people think about it is reappraisal is the best thing. Everything else is worse. And so we should always be training people to reappraise. There also is this idea that reappraisal is very sort of cognitively involved, and that people who are busy or have reduced levels of cognitive functioning for age-related reasons might have trouble implementing reappraisal. To me, I sort of dispute that way of thinking about emotion regulation behavior. None of this to me is neurosurgery or calculus. Like Yes, some emotion regulation behaviors may be slightly more involved to implement. So yes, in reappraisal, you have to think something rather than just distract yourself. But it seems it doesn't make sense to me that any of these are out of anybody's possible range of options. So to me, it seems like training would be to push people to do more of the things that are good rather than show them how to do something they don't know how to do already. They might not be doing it. They might feel like they can't do it or it's not appropriate, but they probably have the capacity to do it. I guess I'm arguing against a capacity argument. I think intervention could push people to do the things that are more adaptive, acknowledging that they're probably already in their repertoire. Maybe they're just not using it for some reason. So I would think more about like the interventions tend to be like, here's how to reappraise. But I would think more about interventions that try to reduce the barrier to reappraisal. Like it's going to work if you do it. You might not think it's going to work, or you might not think you could implement it successfully, but you probably could. But we have that sort of in our long-term plan of working on those things, but we haven't done it ourselves yet.
Thank you.
We have one last question here in the chat. Do you conceptualize mindfulness as a replaceable construct with acceptance in your study? And then second part of that question, how would you conceptualize curiosity as a tactic?
And so I'll take the first one and see if I remember and get to the second one. Thank you very much for asking this about mindfulness and acceptance. Certainly, our work on acceptance should be calling to mind the mindfulness literature, which is also interested in acceptance. One distinction that we've made, we have a few papers on this using a few different kinds of measurement approaches is in the mindfulness literature, typically the idea of acceptance is non-judgmental acceptance, just accepting and it's usually about your feelings. You feel something makes you feel bad, you let it wash over you, and you non-judgmentally accept that is your response. And that is one flavor of acceptance, and it's interesting to think about age differences in that. But there's another aspect of acceptance that I think is more different from the mindfulness component, but I think is also interesting in the context of aging. We talk about it as judgmental acceptance. So there's a situation, I say that's bad. I judge this situation as a bad thing, but I'm accepting it as a bad situation and not letting it impact how I feel. So we contrast that to the non-judgmental acceptance of mindfulness to think there's this other kind of acceptance where you could judgmentally identify something as negative, but decide not accept the situation as negative, but then not feel something about it. So we try, I think it's easy to talk about that distinction. It's harder to measure. Yeah, so that's what I have to say about acceptance, but it is something that we often measure, and it is, in some studies, the most frequently reported emotion regulation behavior. People definitely classify what they're doing as acceptance frequently, so I think it's important to try to dig deeper into what people mean when they respond, yes, that they're doing acceptance in a situation. In terms of curiosity, that's really interesting. I don't think that I've thought about that directly, but just sort of right on the spot. I think it depends on the nature of what people are curious about. It's certainly an approaching kind of tactic. But I do think that people engage in negative approaching when they want to learn more about something negative. I mean, we would not see any negative approaching if people were not interested in hearing bad news or learning about potentially difficult things. And clearly, people do, in some cases, at some times, want to engage with that negative information or need to. And so I think the curiosity is certainly an approaching tactic, but it depends on what what people are curious about, whether, to me, I would say it is positive or negative approaching, but that's a really great question. And the tactic dimensions are not exhaustive. They're just a way of organizing research and aging, but I think tactic dimension could be sort of infinite to think of, and it's interesting to think about what other tactics could be important. Thanks for that question.
All right, thank you so much, Derek. We are pretty much at our time. I'm just going to put up again the slide for next month with the QR code, and I also put the link in the chat in case anybody is available and interested in joining us next month for Going Local, funding older adult programs and services. So with that, I am going to close this out today. So thank you again, Derek, so much, and everyone else for being here.